December 23, 1948, Tokyo. As snow began to fall outside Sugamo Prison, a man who once commanded the fate of millions was about to meet his own. But what should have been a somber conclusion to one of history's most significant war crimes trials, instead, became a scene of unexpected chaos, international controversy, and bitter irony. The man walking toward the gallows had ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor, overseen brutal military campaigns across the Pacific, and held absolute power over the Japanese war machine. Yet his final moments would be marked not by the dignity he desperately sought, but by a series of events so unexpected that they would spark debates lasting decades. What happened in those final hours? How did a carefully orchestrated execution spiral into chaos? And why did the man who had shown no mercy to millions find himself at the center of one of the most controversial executions in modern history? Hideki Tojo's path to the gallows began long before his arrest in 1945. Born into a military family in 1884, Tojo had spent his entire adult life climbing the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army. By 1940, he had become one of the most powerful men in Japan, serving as Minister of War under Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe. But it was in October 1941 that Tojo's fate was truly sealed. When Konoe resigned over disagreements about Japan's military strategy, Emperor Hirohito appointed Tojo as the new Prime Minister. Within 2 months, Tojo had authorized the attack on Pearl Harbor, plunging the United States into World War II, and setting in motion a conflict that would consume the Pacific for nearly 4 years. As both Prime Minister and Minister of War, Tojo wielded unprecedented power. He controlled not only Japan's military strategy, but also its domestic policies. Under his leadership, Japan expanded its brutal occupation across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Military units under his command implemented policies that resulted in the deaths of countless civilians and prisoners of war across occupied territories. Tojo's iron grip on power seemed unshakable until the tide of war began to turn. The devastating defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, followed by the loss of Saipan in 1944, finally broke his political support. In July 1944, facing mounting pressure from other military leaders and even members of the royal family, Tojo was forced to resign all his positions. But resigning from office would not save him from the reckoning that was coming. As American forces closed in on Japan throughout 1945, Tojo knew that surrender would likely mean facing justice for the decisions he had made during his time in power. The question wasn't whether he would be held accountable. It was how he would choose to face that accountability. What happened next would set the stage for one of the most dramatic arrest scenes of the post-war period, and ultimately, the chaotic execution that would follow. September 11th, 1945. Less than a month after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, American military police surrounded Tojo's modest home in the Setagaya district of Tokyo. The former prime minister had been expecting this moment, but his response would shock even the battle-hardened soldiers who came to arrest him. As the Americans approached his house, Tojo retreated to his study. What happened next was captured by photographers and would become one of the most famous images of the post-war period. Rather than surrender quietly, Tojo attempted to take his own life with a pistol shot to the chest, but the shot was not immediately fatal. When American soldiers burst into the room, they found Tojo conscious but gravely wounded, blood spreading across his white shirt. A doctor who had been summoned by Tojo's family was already attempting to treat the wound. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The man who had ordered the deaths of so many was now being saved by American medical personnel. The bullet had missed Tojo's heart by mere inches. As he was rushed to a U.S. Army hospital, photographers captured images of the bloodied former dictator being carried on a stretcher. These photos would soon appear in newspapers around the world, turning Tojo's failed attempt at avoiding capture into a global spectacle. During his recovery, Tojo was placed under constant guard. American officials were determined that he would stand trial for his wartime actions. As he slowly regained his strength in the hospital bed, Tojo began to realize that his fate was no longer in his own hands. The man who had once controlled the destiny of an empire was now a prisoner, dependent on his former enemies for his very survival. The medical care provided by American doctors was extensive and professional. They worked to save the life of a man who had been their enemy just weeks before, demonstrating a commitment to justice over revenge. This irony would follow Tojo throughout his remaining years. He owed his life to the very people he had sought to destroy. But saving Tojo's life was only the beginning. The Americans had much larger plans for the former prime minister. He would become the most prominent defendant in what would be known as the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, a legal proceeding that would determine the fate of Japan's wartime leadership and set precedents for international justice. By May 1946, Tojo had recovered sufficiently to stand trial. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, modeled after the Nuremberg trials in Germany, convened in the former Japanese Army headquarters building in Tokyo. The symbolism was intentional. Justice would be served in the very building where many of the wartime decisions had been made. Tojo faced charges under 3 categories: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The prosecution argued that as Prime Minister and Minister of War, he bore primary responsibility for Japan's aggressive wars and the atrocities committed during the occupation of various territories. The evidence presented was overwhelming in its scope and detail. The trial proceedings revealed the extent of Tojo's influence during the war years. Witnesses testified about his role in planning aggressive military campaigns, his oversight of prisoner of war camps, and his implementation of policies that resulted in widespread civilian casualties. Documents recovered from Japanese government archives showed his direct involvement in major strategic decisions. What made Tojo's situation particularly precarious was his position at the top of Japan's military hierarchy. Unlike lower-ranking officials who could claim they were merely following orders, Tojo was one of the people giving those orders. The prosecution painted him as the architect of Japan's wartime strategy and a key figure in the decision-making process that led to numerous atrocities. Throughout the lengthy proceedings, Tojo maintained his composure. He appeared in court wearing a simple gray suit, often taking detailed notes as testimony proceeded. His defense team argued that he had acted in what he believed were the best interests of Japan, and that many decisions attributed to him had actually been made collectively by the government and military leadership. The trial lasted for over 2 years, with hundreds of witnesses and thousands of documents presented as evidence. International journalists covered every day of the proceedings, turning the courtroom into a stage for post-war justice. The world was watching to see how the victorious Allies would handle the defeated Axis leaders. As the trial neared its conclusion in 1948, it became increasingly clear that Tojo would be found guilty on multiple charges. The question was no longer whether he would be convicted, but what his punishment would be. The prosecution was seeking the ultimate penalty, and given the scale of the crimes involved, few observers expected mercy. But even as the verdict approached, few could have predicted how chaotic and controversial the final chapter of Tojo's life would become. November 12th, 1948. After more than 2 years of testimony and deliberation, the tribunal was finally ready to announce its verdict. The courtroom was packed with journalists, military officials, and observers from around the world. Tojo sat quietly as the chief judge began reading the lengthy decision. The verdict was devastating but not unexpected. Tojo was found guilty on multiple counts of crimes against peace and war crimes. The tribunal concluded that he had played a central role in planning and executing Japan's aggressive wars and bore significant responsibility for the treatment of prisoners of war and civilians in occupied territories. When the judge announced that Tojo would be sentenced to death by hanging, there was little visible reaction from the defendant. He had been preparing for this possibility throughout the trial. However, the calm in the courtroom belied the intense international debate that would soon erupt over the sentence. The death penalty for Tojo was controversial from the moment it was announced. Critics argued that selective justice was being applied. Emperor Hirohito, who had also been involved in wartime decision-making, was not even charged. Others questioned whether executing defeated leaders would set a dangerous precedent for future conflicts. Support for the death sentence came primarily from countries that had suffered under Japanese occupation. Representatives from China, the Philippines, and other affected nations argued that anything less than the ultimate penalty would be insufficient given the scale of the crimes committed. Tojo himself seemed to accept his fate with resignation. In his final statement to the tribunal, he expressed regret for the suffering caused by the war, but maintained that he had acted in what he believed were Japan's best interests. He did not beg for mercy or attempt to shift blame to others, earning grudging respect even from some of his accusers. The appeals process was swift by modern standards. Tojo's lawyers filed the required motions, but there was little hope that the sentence would be overturned. The evidence against him had been comprehensive, and the legal proceedings had been conducted with careful attention to due process. By late 1948, all appeals had been exhausted. General Douglas MacArthur, as Supreme Commander of Allied powers in Japan, had the authority to commute the sentence, but he chose not to intervene. The execution was scheduled for December 23rd, just 2 days before Christmas. But even as preparations for the execution began, few anticipated the extraordinary events that would unfold in Tojo's final hours. As December 23rd approached, Tojo was moved to Sugamo Prison, where the execution would take place. The former prime minister spent his final days in a small cell, attended by Buddhist priests and allowed visits from family members. His demeanor remained calm, almost philosophical, as he prepared for death. The choice of December 23rd for the execution was not accidental. American officials wanted to ensure that the executions took place before Christmas, believing that carrying out death sentences during the holiday season would be inappropriate. This scheduling decision would later add another layer of controversy to the proceedings. During his final days, Tojo wrote extensively. He penned letters to his family, composed poems in the traditional Japanese style, and continued working on his memoirs. These writings would later provide insight into his mindset during those last hours, revealing a man who remained convinced that he had served his country to the best of his ability. International media attention intensified as the execution date approached. Journalists from around the world gathered in Tokyo, eager to witness or report on the final chapter of one of the war's most prominent figures. The execution had become a global event, watched by millions who had lived through the war years. Behind the scenes, however, complications were already emerging. Prison officials discovered logistical challenges in conducting multiple executions simultaneously. Tojo was not the only war criminal scheduled to die that day. 6 other Japanese leaders were to be executed alongside him, creating unprecedented coordination challenges. The gallows had been constructed according to American military specifications, but questions arose about whether the equipment would function properly. Military engineers conducted multiple tests, but concerns lingered about the mechanics of the execution process. More troubling were reports of communication breakdowns between different military units responsible for the execution. The process involved coordination between the prison administration, military police, medical personnel, and media relations staff. As December 23rd dawned, it became clear that not all of these groups were working from the same set of procedures. Weather added another complicating factor. A winter storm had moved through Tokyo, creating icy conditions around the prison. The combination of snow, cold temperatures, and the high-stress nature of the execution created an atmosphere ripe for unexpected problems. What no one anticipated was just how dramatically these seemingly minor issues would compound into something much more significant. December 23, 1948 began before dawn at Sugamo Prison. As prison officials made their final preparations, the first signs of trouble were already emerging. The execution was scheduled to begin at midnight, but coordination problems had already caused delays. The 7 condemned men, including Tojo, were moved to holding cells near the execution chamber in the early evening. Each was attended by religious counselors of their choosing. Tojo spent his final hours with Buddhist priests, engaging in meditation and prayer according to traditional practices. At 11:30 p.m., the execution process began. Protocol required that each condemned man be brought individually to the gallows, with the entire procedure witnessed by official observers, medical personnel, and selected media representatives. The plan was to conduct all 7 executions in sequence, with minimal delay between each. Tojo was designated to be executed third in the sequence. As he waited in his holding cell, he could hear the activities surrounding the first execution. The sounds of footsteps, muffled conversations, and mechanical preparations created a tense atmosphere throughout the prison block. When Tojo's turn came, he walked calmly to the execution chamber. Witnesses later described his demeanor as dignified and controlled. He made no final statement beyond a brief bow to the assembled observers. Prison officials began the standard procedures for preparing him for execution, but as the noose was placed around Tojo's neck, the first major problem occurred. The mechanism controlling the trap door malfunctioned. What should have been a swift, instantaneous process instead became a prolonged ordeal as technicians attempted to repair the equipment while Tojo stood waiting on the gallows. The delay stretched for nearly 20 minutes. During this time, Tojo remained standing on the platform, the noose around his neck, as officials worked frantically to resolve the mechanical failure. The situation was unprecedented. No one had prepared contingency plans for such an equipment malfunction during an execution. Medical personnel standing by grew increasingly concerned about the psychological impact of the prolonged delay. International observers began questioning whether the execution should be postponed, but military officials were determined to proceed as scheduled. When the equipment was finally repaired, the execution proceeded, but the damage to the carefully orchestrated process was already done. The malfunction had turned what was intended to be a solemn, dignified procedure into a chaotic spectacle that would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. The remaining executions proceeded with additional delays and complications. News of the mechanical failures spread quickly among international media representatives, who began filing stories about the chaotic nature of the proceedings, even before all 7 executions were completed. Word of the execution difficulties spread rapidly through international diplomatic channels. By the time the sun rose on December 24th, newspapers around the world were reporting not just on Tojo's death, but on the chaotic circumstances surrounding it. The mechanical failures during the execution process became a source of international embarrassment for American occupation authorities. Critics argued that the botched executions reflected poorly on American competence and organization. Supporters of the executions were dismayed that technical problems had overshadowed what they viewed as a necessary act of justice. Religious leaders from various denominations expressed concern about the timing of the executions. Conducting death sentences just hours before Christmas struck many as inappropriate, regardless of the crimes involved. The Christmas Eve timing added a layer of moral complexity to discussions about the executions. Japanese public reaction was mixed and complex. While many Japanese citizens had grown to despise Tojo and other military leaders for bringing destruction to their country, others viewed the chaotic execution as disrespectful to Japanese dignity. The manner of his death became as significant as the death itself in shaping public memory. International legal experts began questioning whether the execution procedures met appropriate standards for dignity and humanity. While the death penalty itself had been legally imposed, the chaotic implementation raised questions about the American military's preparedness for carrying out such significant judicial sentences. Soviet representatives who had participated in the War Crimes Tribunal criticized the American handling of the executions. They argued that the technical failures demonstrated American incompetence and suggested that the entire post-war justice process was flawed. This criticism became part of broader Cold War tensions that were already emerging between former allies. Chinese officials, representing a country that had suffered enormously under Japanese occupation, expressed frustration that the botched execution had created sympathy for Tojo among some observers. They had wanted his death to serve as a clear statement about justice for war crimes, not to become a source of controversy about execution procedures. Military officials attempted damage control by emphasizing that the executions had ultimately been carried out and that justice had been served. However, internal investigations were already beginning into what had gone wrong and how such problems could be prevented in future situations. The chaotic nature of Tojo's execution had consequences that extended far beyond that December night in 1948. Within weeks, American military authorities implemented new protocols for any future executions, though none of the remaining war criminals sentenced to death would be executed. The mechanical failures during the execution process became a case study in military logistics and planning. Training manuals were revised to address contingency planning for equipment malfunctions during high-stakes operations. The incident demonstrated how technical problems could undermine even the most carefully planned procedures. More significantly, the controversy surrounding Tojo's execution contributed to changing American attitudes toward the death penalty for war criminals. Future military tribunals would be much more cautious about imposing death sentences, partly due to the complications that arose from implementing them. The timing of the executions, just before Christmas, continued to generate debate for years afterward. Religious groups used the incident as an example of the need for more thoughtful consideration of moral and spiritual factors in judicial proceedings. The date became symbolic of the tension between justice and mercy in post-war reconciliation efforts. Tojo's family was deeply affected by both his death and the manner in which it occurred. His wife and children had to cope not only with his execution, but with the international attention and controversy surrounding it, the chaotic circumstances made their grief more complex and public than it might otherwise have been. Historical assessments of Tojo's execution have evolved over the decades. While there is broad consensus that he bore significant responsibility for wartime atrocities and that his prosecution was justified, the implementation of his death sentence is often cited as an example of how not to conduct such proceedings. The mechanical failures during the execution became part of Tojo's historical legacy in ways that would have seemed impossible to predict. Instead of being remembered primarily for his wartime actions or his defiant final words, his death became notorious for the chaos that surrounded it. Modern scholars studying post-war justice often point to Tojo's execution as a turning point in international attitudes toward implementing death sentences for war crimes. The complications that arose helped establish precedents for more careful consideration of execution procedures in international legal proceedings. The chaotic execution of Hideki Tojo represents more than just a botched implementation of justice. It serves as a window into the complexities of post-war reconciliation and the challenges of establishing international legal precedents. The mechanical failures that plagued the execution process highlighted the gap between legal theory and practical implementation in post-war justice efforts. While the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal had successfully established legal frameworks for prosecuting war crimes, the execution process revealed that less attention had been paid to the practical aspects of implementing those legal decisions. The international controversy generated by the execution difficulties also demonstrated the emerging tensions of the Cold War era. Soviet criticism of American competence, Chinese frustration with the focus on procedure rather than justice, and European concerns about the death penalty all reflected broader geopolitical divisions that would define the post-war world. For Japan, Tojo's chaotic execution became part of a complex national reckoning with the war years. The manner of his death allowed some Japanese to view him as a victim of American incompetence rather than focusing solely on his role in wartime atrocities. This complicated the process of national reflection and accountability that was necessary for post-war reconciliation. The execution also set important precedents for future international war crimes tribunals. The problems encountered during Tojo's execution influenced procedures developed for later international courts, including those established for conflicts in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Modern international justice institutions have implemented much more comprehensive protocols for implementing court decisions. The incident demonstrated the importance of technical competence in maintaining the moral authority of judicial proceedings. The legal case against Tojo had been thorough and convincing, but the botched execution undermined confidence in the entire post-war justice process among some observers. Perhaps most significantly, the chaotic nature of Tojo's execution contributed to a broader shift away from capital punishment in international war crimes proceedings. While death sentences continued to be imposed by some national courts, international tribunals became increasingly reluctant to seek ultimate penalties, partly due to the complications associated with implementing them. The legacy of December 23, 1948, serves as a reminder that justice is not just about reaching correct legal conclusions, but also about implementing those conclusions in ways that maintain dignity and moral authority. Tojo's execution failed on the implementation side, creating lasting questions about the effectiveness of post-war justice efforts. The execution of Hideki Tojo was intended to serve as a definitive statement about justice and accountability in the aftermath of World War II. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about the importance of thorough preparation and technical competence in implementing judicial decisions. The events of that December night transformed what should have been a moment of closure into a source of enduring controversy and international embarrassment. The mechanical failures that turned Tojo's execution into a chaotic spectacle overshadowed the legal proceedings that had led to his death sentence. What should have been remembered as a moment of justice became notorious for its procedural problems and international controversy. The image of Tojo standing for 20 minutes on the gallows, while technicians frantically worked to repair broken equipment, became more memorable than any of the testimony about his wartime crimes. The incident revealed the challenges inherent in post-war justice efforts. Establishing legal frameworks for prosecuting war crimes was difficult enough, but implementing the decisions of those frameworks proved equally challenging. The gap between legal theory and practical implementation had serious consequences for the credibility of the entire process. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal had spent over 2 years carefully documenting Tojo's crimes and following proper legal procedures. Yet all of that meticulous work was overshadowed by a mechanical malfunction that lasted less than half an hour. The irony was particularly bitter for those who had worked to establish international justice. Prosecutors who had spent months gathering evidence and presenting arguments found their work remembered primarily for its chaotic conclusion rather than its legal substance. The failure highlighted how even the most carefully constructed legal proceedings could be undermined by inadequate attention to practical details. Tojo's chaotic execution also demonstrated how technical failures could have profound political and diplomatic consequences. The mechanical problems during the execution process generated international criticism, complicated post-war reconciliation efforts, and influenced future approaches to international justice. What began as a malfunction in prison equipment evolved into a diplomatic crisis that strained relationships between allied nations and undermined confidence in American leadership. The Christmas Eve timing of the execution, which had seemed like a minor scheduling consideration, became another source of controversy when combined with the mechanical failures. Religious leaders who might have remained silent about a smoothly conducted execution instead found themselves criticizing both the timing and the chaotic implementation. The combination created a perfect storm of negative publicity that damaged the reputation of post-war justice efforts. The legacy of that December night in 1948 extends far beyond the death of one war criminal. It serves as a reminder that justice requires not only correct legal decisions, but also competent implementation of those decisions. The failure to properly execute the execution, so to speak, undermine the moral authority of the entire post-war justice process. Legal scholars studying transitional justice continue to reference Tojo's execution as an example of how procedural failures can undermine even the most justified legal outcomes. The incident also highlighted the vulnerability of international legal institutions to seemingly minor practical problems. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal had successfully navigated complex questions of international law, jurisdiction, and evidence, but was nearly discredited by a malfunctioning trapdoor. This vulnerability became a key consideration in designing future international courts, which implemented extensive backup procedures and contingency plans to prevent similar embarrassments. For modern students of history and international law, Tojo's execution provides important lessons about the complexities of transitional justice. It demonstrates that establishing legal accountability for mass atrocities requires careful attention to both legal procedures and practical implementation challenges. The case has become a standard example in law schools of how procedural competence is essential to maintaining the legitimacy of legal institutions. The execution also serves as a reminder of how quickly public attention can shift from substantive questions to procedural controversies. The international community had spent years debating whether war criminals should face death sentences, but the mechanical failures during Tojo's execution redirected that debate toward questions about American competence and preparedness. The substantive questions about justice and accountability were temporarily overshadowed by concerns about technical execution. The broader lesson extends beyond legal proceedings to any situation where institutions must implement difficult or controversial decisions. The Tojo execution demonstrated that the manner of implementation can be as important as the decision itself in determining public acceptance and institutional credibility. This lesson has influenced everything from corporate governance to government policy implementation in the decades since. The man who had once wielded absolute power over the Japanese war machine died not as he had lived, in control and commanding, but as a victim of mechanical failure and bureaucratic confusion. The irony was perhaps fitting for someone who had often prioritized military efficiency and technical precision. Yet it was not the kind of justice that the post-war world had hoped to establish. His death became symbolic of the broader challenges facing international cooperation in the atomic age. The contrast between Tojo's wartime authority and his helpless final moments was stark and troubling. As Prime Minister and Minister of War, he had commanded millions of soldiers and controlled the fate of entire nations. Yet in his final minutes, he stood powerless on a gallows platform, while American technicians struggled with broken equipment. The reversal of fortune was complete, but the manner of that reversal left many observers uncomfortable rather than satisfied. In the end, Hideki Tojo's execution became remembered not for bringing closure to the war crimes of World War II, but for the chaos that ensued when human planning met mechanical reality. It remains one of history's most controversial executions, memorable for all the wrong reasons. The incident stands as a permanent reminder that justice, no matter how carefully planned or legally justified, can be undermined by failures of implementation that seem trivial in comparison to the momentous decisions they affect. The execution of December 23, 1948, achieved its immediate goal. Hideki Tojo was dead, and he would never again threaten international peace. But the chaotic manner of his death created new problems that lasted far longer than the man himself. The botched execution became a symbol of the challenges facing post-war international cooperation, a cautionary tale about the importance of thorough preparation, and a reminder that even the most justified acts of justice can be undermined by failures of competence and planning. For those who had suffered under Japanese occupation, Tojo's death provided some measure of closure, but the chaotic circumstances surrounding it prevented the clear sense of justice that many had hoped to achieve. Instead of ending the chapter on wartime atrocities with a clear statement about accountability, the execution opened new chapters of controversy and debate that continue to influence international law and diplomacy today. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.